Go ahead, show everyone what you've got. Unless you're afraid.
I never play to impress anyone.
Besides the grand piano stood a silver microphone, and Ethan Caldwell smiled as though he were about to crown a champion. "Go ahead," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the glittering ballroom. "Play something impressive. Unless you're afraid, everyone will discover you were never more than a waitress." The laughter came first. Soft, polite, expensive. Crystal glasses caught the warm glow of chandeliers while a string quartet quietly faded into silence. Every musician lowering their instruments as hundreds of distinguished guests turned toward the magnificent black Steinway resting beneath a spotlight. The annual Caldwell Foundation Gala was never simply another charity event. It was where billion-dollar partnerships were whispered over champagne, where governors shook hands with venture capitalists, where magazine covers were born before dessert was even served. Every tuxedo, every designer gown, every perfectly rehearsed smile existed for one reason: influence. And tonight, influence belonged to one man. Ethan Caldwell had built one of America's largest investment empires before turning 40. Newspapers called him brilliant. Television hosts called him fearless. His competitors called him impossible. He had a habit of controlling every room he entered, not by raising his voice, but by making everyone else lower theirs. People admired him because success followed him everywhere. They feared him because kindness rarely did. Standing only a few feet away, Naomi Brooks tightened her grip around the polished silver serving tray resting against her hip. Her crisp black uniform blended into the elegant backdrop so completely that most guests had barely noticed her all evening. She had quietly refilled water glasses, replaced folded linen napkins, and moved through the ballroom with practiced precision, almost invisible despite serving the most powerful people in California. That invisibility had always been part of the job. She accepted it with grace. But tonight, someone had decided invisible was no longer enough. Earlier, Ethan had overheard another guest mention that one of the servers had paused beside the ballroom piano during setup, gently brushing dust from its polished surface with unusual care. She looked like she actually knew the instrument, the guest had joked. Ethan found the comment amusing. After all, what better entertainment for a room filled with billionaires than watching an ordinary waitress stumble through a performance she could never possibly deliver? So he made an offer that sounded generous while feeling unmistakably cruel. If she played well, everyone would applaud. If she failed, well, everyone would laugh. Either outcome entertained the room. "Come on," Ethan continued, casually swirling the sparkling water in his crystal glass. "You've been staring at that piano all night. Here's your chance." Several guests exchanged awkward glances. Others lifted their phones just enough to capture whatever embarrassing moment might follow. The hotel manager forced a nervous smile, unable to challenge the evening's most influential donor. Somewhere near the back of the ballroom, a photographer adjusted his camera lens. The air itself seemed to grow heavier. Naomi slowly looked from Ethan to the grand piano waiting beneath the spotlight. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. She didn't explain herself. Instead, she quietly set her serving tray onto a nearby table with careful hands, smoothing the front of her uniform as though preparing for something only she understood. 5 long seconds passed. 5 silent seconds that somehow felt louder than the laughter before them. Ethan leaned comfortably against the edge of the piano, completely certain he had already won. Around him, executives smiled with quiet anticipation, convinced they were about to witness an amusing interruption before returning to million-dollar conversations. None of them noticed the subtle change in Naomi's expression. It wasn't fear leaving her face. It was memory returning. Her eyes rested on the polished ivory keys with a familiarity that no stranger could ever fake. For the first time that evening, she wasn't looking at an expensive instrument. She was looking at an old promise that had never truly left her. And as the ballroom waited for a waitress to embarrass herself, destiny waited for an empire to discover that silence and weakness had never been the same thing. Before we continue, if you enjoy unforgettable stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary moments, subscribe to Hidden Table. Every story reminds us that true character is revealed through courage, compassion, and the choices we make when no one is watching. Now, let's see what happens next. Naomi took one slow step toward the grand piano, and every conversation inside the ballroom dissolved into an uneasy silence. The polished marble floor reflected the glow of crystal chandeliers while dozens of cameras, some professional and many held discreetly in guests' hands, quietly shifted in her direction. The orchestra remained perfectly still, waiting for instructions that never came. Even the hotel staff stopped moving. Glasses remained unfilled. Plates rested untouched. It was as though the entire evening had forgotten how to breathe. Ethan Caldwell watched with quiet satisfaction, convinced he had transformed an ordinary charity gala into unforgettable entertainment. He believed people admired confidence most when it came wrapped in authority, and he had spent years proving that assumption correct. To him, this was harmless fun, a spontaneous challenge that would give his distinguished guests another story to tell over private flights and executive board meetings. Around him, investors exchanged knowing smiles. One whispered that the evening had suddenly become much more interesting. Another quietly predicted she would refuse before ever reaching the piano bench. Nobody expected excellence. They expected discomfort. Naomi continued forward without rushing. Her shoes made almost no sound against the polished floor. She neither lowered her head nor searched the room for sympathy. Instead, she studied the Steinway itself. The deep black finish reflected hundreds of tiny lights overhead, making the instrument appear less like furniture and more like a silent witness waiting patiently for the truth to arrive. Her fingertips hovered only inches above the polished lid before she gently rested her hand against the cool surface. That single touch carried a familiarity impossible to explain to strangers. The elderly piano technician standing near the stage noticed it immediately. He had cared for concert instruments for more than 30 years, and he recognized the difference between someone admiring a piano and someone greeting an old friend. His eyebrows lifted ever so slightly, though he said nothing. Across the ballroom, the hotel manager nervously adjusted his tie while silently wishing the moment would end before anyone's dignity suffered further. Yet something unexpected had already begun to shift. The laughter that had filled the room only moments earlier was fading. In its place came curiosity. Human beings recognized confidence instinctively, and Naomi carried herself with the quiet certainty of someone who belonged exactly where she stood. Ethan noticed the subtle change as well, although he interpreted it differently. He assumed she had simply accepted defeat with admirable composure. Smiling politely, he gestured toward the piano bench. "Whenever you are ready," he said, his tone almost generous now that the audience had fully gathered. Naomi nodded once in acknowledgement, but offered no reply. Words felt unnecessary. She slowly removed the simple silver bracelet from her wrist and placed it carefully beside the piano, handling it with the same respect someone might reserve for a treasured family photograph. Hidden inside that small gesture lived years no one in the ballroom could imagine. Long mornings before school. Countless evenings filled with scales instead of television. A grandmother whose patient voice still echoed somewhere deep inside her memory, reminding her that music was never about proving people wrong. It was about revealing who you truly were when the world stopped listening. Several guests leaned closer, sensing that something unusual lingered beneath the surface. A young violinist from the orchestra exchanged a puzzled glance with the conductor. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. Experience had taught them that extraordinary performances often announced themselves long before the first note was ever played. Naomi finally lowered herself onto the piano bench with calm, measured grace. She adjusted the distance only slightly, straightened her back, and allowed both hands to rest quietly above the keys without touching them. Her eyes closed for only a heartbeat. Then they opened again, clear and steady, carrying none of the fear the room had expected to see. For one endless moment, nothing happened. Naomi remained perfectly still, her hands suspended above the ivory keys as though listening to a conversation that nobody else could hear. The silence spread through the ballroom with surprising weight. It settled over polished tables, crystal chandeliers, and whispered conversations until even the soft hum of the air conditioning seemed louder than before. Ethan Caldwell glanced around with quiet confidence, expecting hesitation to expose itself at any second. He had seen countless people freeze under pressure. Executives stumbled through presentations. Politicians lost their composure. Entrepreneurs forgot carefully rehearsed pitches. Public pressure had a way of revealing weakness. That was exactly what he expected tonight. A few guests smiled impatiently, assuming the performance had already failed before it began. One venture capitalist leaned toward his companion and quietly remarked that perhaps someone should save the young waitress from further embarrassment. Another guest reached for her champagne, convinced the awkward moment was nearly over. Only the elderly piano technician continued watching Naomi's posture instead of her expression. Her shoulders were relaxed. Her elbows floated naturally. Her wrists rested at precisely the height every classical instructor spent years teaching their students to achieve. There was nothing accidental about the way she sat. Every detail reflected discipline shaped over thousands of unseen hours. Near the orchestra, the conductor slowly folded his arms. He noticed something even more unusual. Naomi was not searching for courage. She was searching for tempo. Her breathing settled into an almost invisible rhythm, steady and controlled, as though she were silently counting measures before an orchestra entered. Musicians recognized that instinct immediately. It could not be improvised. It had to be earned. Across the ballroom, the hotel manager felt his heartbeat slowing for an entirely different reason. He suddenly remembered a quiet evening nearly 8 months earlier when he had walked through the ballroom after closing time. One lonely melody had drifted through the empty room. He had assumed one of the hotel musicians was practicing before discovering only a young waitress gently wiping fingerprints from the piano. The music had stopped the instant she realized someone was listening. She had apologized politely, insisting she was only making sure every key functioned properly before the next event. He had smiled, accepted the explanation, and never mentioned it again. Tonight, that forgotten memory returned with unexpected clarity. Ethan remained unaware of every silent realization unfolding around him. He adjusted the cuff of his tailored jacket and offered another confident smile to the guests seated nearest the stage. He believed anticipation belonged entirely to him. After all, he had created this moment. He had invited the audience. He had issued the challenge. In his mind, every pair of eyes still followed his lead. Naomi slowly opened her fingers, allowing them to settle gently onto the keyboard for the very first time. She did not press a single note. Instead, she felt the smooth surface beneath her fingertips with unmistakable familiarity, almost as though greeting someone she had missed for years. Deep inside her memory, another pair of hands seemed to cover her own. Older hands, patient hands, hands that had once reminded a little girl that the greatest musicians never played to impress strangers. They played to tell the truth without speaking. Naomi inhaled quietly. The spotlight reflected softly across the polished lid of the Steinway while hundreds of silent faces waited for either failure or surprise. Nobody could possibly know that the next sound would not simply begin a performance. It would quietly unravel every assumption that had filled the ballroom only moments before. The first note arrived so softly that several guests were not even certain they had heard it. It did not demand attention. It invited it. A single clear tone drifted through the ballroom like the first star appearing in an evening sky, gentle enough to quiet every restless thought without asking permission. Naomi allowed the sound to fade completely before touching the next key. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, those simple notes began weaving together into a melody so balanced and deliberate that conversations disappeared on their own. Crystal glasses remained suspended halfway to waiting lips. Phones that had been raised to capture an embarrassing moment suddenly stopped moving. The room was no longer watching a waitress. It was listening to an artist. Ethan Caldwell's confident smile remained in place, but only because surprise had not yet reached his expression. He assumed she had memorized a pleasant little tune from childhood, nothing more. Classical music had surrounded him since he was young. His parents had hired private performers for family dinners, and the finest concert halls in New York, Chicago, and Boston had become almost routine destinations. He knew enough to recognize polished entertainment, and enough to believe that true mastery belonged only to the world's elite performers. Yet something about Naomi's touch unsettled him. There was no hesitation between phrases, no uncertainty in her timing. Each note seemed to arrive exactly where it belonged, breathing naturally into the next with effortless confidence. The elderly piano technician slowly removed his glasses and smiled to himself. His years had taught him that expensive instruments revealed the truth about anyone who touched them. Beginners forced sound from the keys. Professionals controlled it. Masters simply allowed the piano to speak. Naomi was doing something even rarer. She was listening to the instrument while playing it. Near the orchestra, the conductor exchanged another silent glance with the first violinist. Neither could identify the arrangement immediately because Naomi was not performing it exactly as written. She had taken a familiar American concert piece and quietly reshaped its emotional center, allowing delicate passages to linger before releasing them into richer harmonies. It was the kind of artistic confidence musicians developed only after years of disciplined study. Several guests who rarely paid attention to classical music could not explain why they suddenly felt emotional. One woman lowered her eyes as memories of her late father unexpectedly surfaced. An older businessman unconsciously loosened his tie, realizing he had not taken a full breath since the performance began. Across the ballroom, the photographers who had expected laughter now found themselves carefully adjusting focus, instinctively trying to preserve a moment they no longer understood. The melody continued growing, never becoming louder than necessary. Instead of overwhelming the room, it gently transformed it. The polished marble floors seemed warmer beneath the chandelier light. Even the towering windows overlooking the city skyline reflected a quieter version of the celebration inside. The gala had begun as a showcase for wealth and influence. Somehow, without saying a single word, Naomi was turning it into something deeply human. Ethan finally leaned forward, his fingers resting against the edge of a nearby table. His confidence remained, but certainty had begun slipping away. He recognized technical precision. He recognized remarkable control. What troubled him was something far more difficult to explain. She was not playing for applause. She was not trying to prove him wrong. Every phrase carried the calm assurance of someone honoring a promise made long before anyone in this ballroom had ever learned her name. And for the first time that evening, Ethan Caldwell realized he was no longer directing the room. The music was. The melody rose with quiet confidence, unfolding one graceful phrase after another until the ballroom no longer felt like the center of a corporate celebration. It felt like a concert hall where every heartbeat instinctively synchronized with the music floating through the air. Naomi never exaggerated a movement. Her shoulders remained relaxed. Her breathing stayed steady. Every note carried intention rather than display, and that restraint somehow made the performance even more captivating. Guests who had attended performances at Carnegie Hall and Lincoln Center slowly lowered their glasses onto the tables without making a sound. Nobody wanted the smallest interruption to disturb what was happening before them. A distinguished woman seated near the front, known throughout New York for sponsoring young classical musicians, narrowed her eyes in disbelief. She leaned toward the gentleman beside her and whispered, "That phrasing is not taught in ordinary lessons." Someone trained her exceptionally well. The gentleman answered only with a slow nod, unable to pull his attention away from the stage. Near the orchestra, the first violinist quietly smiled. He recognized subtle details that escaped nearly everyone else. Naomi was not simply reproducing notes from memory. She was shaping every musical sentence with extraordinary maturity, allowing silence to become just as meaningful as sound. That balance required more than talent. It required years of discipline, sacrifice, and emotional understanding. Ethan Caldwell remained standing exactly where he had been moments earlier, yet something inside him had begun shifting in ways he could neither explain nor control. He had expected awkwardness. He had prepared himself to politely applaud an amateur effort before the evening returned to business. Instead, every passing measure made him question the assumptions that had led him here. He found himself studying Naomi instead of the audience. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction at proving anyone wrong. She played with remarkable humility, almost as though the crowded ballroom had disappeared entirely. It was not a performance for wealthy donors. It was a conversation with someone no longer present. The elderly piano technician quietly wiped the corner of one eye before anyone noticed. He remembered tuning this same Steinway only a few hours earlier, wondering whether anyone attending the gala would truly appreciate the instrument's remarkable voice. Tonight, he realized the piano had finally found someone worthy of it. Across the ballroom, the hotel manager slowly exhaled. relief mixed with admiration as memories returned more vividly than ever. He understood now why that mysterious melody months earlier had sounded so complete despite the empty room. Naomi had never been casually exploring the keyboard. She had simply believed no one was listening. Several younger staff members gathered discreetly near the service entrance, watching with quiet pride. They had worked beside Naomi for more than 2 years. They knew her as dependable, thoughtful, and endlessly kind. Yet none of them had imagined she carried this extraordinary gift beneath the routine of folded napkins, polished silverware, and endless evening shifts. One by one, the guests who had quietly lifted their phones earlier now lowered them again. Recording no longer seemed important. Living inside the moment mattered more. Even the city lights beyond the ballroom windows appeared softer against the night sky, reflecting like scattered stars across the river below. As Naomi reached the end of the movement, her fingers lingered for the briefest instant above the final chord before allowing it to bloom naturally through the room. The sound drifted outward with quiet dignity, filling every corner before slowly fading into complete silence. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence that followed carried more respect than applause ever could, and in that unforgettable stillness, Ethan Caldwell realized he had invited everyone to witness a humiliation. Instead, they had all witnessed greatness. The silence lasted longer than anyone expected. It was not the uncomfortable silence that follows an awkward mistake. It was the kind that settles over a room after everyone realizes they have just witnessed something impossible to forget. Naomi kept her hands resting lightly above the keyboard for one final breath before lowering them into her lap. She neither smiled nor searched the crowd for approval. She simply allowed the last vibration of the Steinway to disappear naturally into the ballroom. Around her, hundreds of distinguished guests remained completely still, almost afraid that speaking too soon would somehow diminish what they had just experienced. Ethan Caldwell stood motionless beside the piano, his expression carefully controlled, but the certainty that had defined him all evening had quietly vanished. He had built his reputation on reading people within minutes. Investors, competitors, journalists, politicians. He believed everyone revealed themselves under pressure. Yet the woman sitting only a few feet away had overturned every conclusion he had reached about her without saying more than a single word. Finally, someone near the back of the ballroom began applauding. One pair of hands, then another. Within seconds, the sound spread across the room like a rising wave. Executives, philanthropists, musicians, community leaders, and hotel staff all stood together, offering a standing ovation that seemed to grow louder with every heartbeat. The applause carried none of the polite obligation expected at formal galas. It carried genuine admiration. Naomi slowly rose from the piano bench, giving a small respectful nod toward the audience before reaching for the simple silver bracelet she had placed beside the instrument. She slipped it back onto her wrist with quiet care, as though returning to the life she had been living only minutes earlier. She made no dramatic gesture. She did not bow deeply or acknowledge individual compliments. To her, the performance had never been about winning. It had been about honoring something far older than the ballroom itself. The elderly piano technician approached the stage with measured steps, stopping just short of the piano. His eyes shone with unmistakable emotion. "Young lady," he said softly, ensuring only those nearest could hear him. "I have maintained concert pianos for more than 3 decades. Tonight, you reminded me why I chose this profession." Naomi smiled with quiet gratitude. "Thank you," she answered simply. "The piano made it easy." The technician chuckled gently, shaking his head. "No," he replied. "You did." Nearby, members of the orchestra exchanged smiles filled with professional respect. The conductor removed his glasses, still studying Naomi with open curiosity. "Where did you study?" he finally asked. Before Naomi could answer, she lowered her eyes briefly and said, "A very patient teacher believed that music should always speak louder than pride." It was an answer that revealed almost nothing and somehow explained everything. Ethan heard every word. For perhaps the first time in many years, he found himself with no immediate response. Money had solved countless problems throughout his career. Influence had opened nearly every door. Reputation had shaped every negotiation. Yet none of those things explained the quiet dignity standing before him. Across the ballroom, conversations resumed, But they were different now. Nobody discussed stock prices or acquisitions. Instead, guests asked one another the same question in hushed voices. Who was she? How could someone with that extraordinary level of artistry remain completely unknown? The mystery spread faster than any business rumor. Naomi gently picked up the serving tray she had set aside earlier, preparing to return to work as though nothing remarkable had happened. That simple act astonished the audience even more than the performance itself. Greatness had stepped into the spotlight without asking for recognition, and now it was quietly walking away from it. Ethan watched her leave the stage, unaware that the answers everyone sought were about to reshape not only the evening, but his understanding of success, respect, and the remarkable stories hidden behind people the world too often overlooked. Naomi had almost reached the service station when an unfamiliar voice stopped her. Miss Brooks. She turned slowly. The conductor had stepped away from the orchestra, accompanied by the elderly piano technician and the distinguished woman who sponsored young classical musicians across the country. They were no longer looking at her with curiosity. They were looking at her with recognition. "Forgive me for asking," the woman said gently, "but did you ever study under Professor Eleanor Whitmore?" Naomi hesitated for only a moment before giving a small nod. A quiet murmur spread among those close enough to hear the exchange. Eleanor Whitmore had been one of the most respected piano instructors in America, a teacher whose students regularly filled the world's finest concert halls. The conductor smiled with sudden understanding. "I thought I recognized her interpretation," he said softly. There was always a warmth beneath the precision. That was her signature. Naomi lowered her eyes, and for the first time that evening, memories became stronger than the ballroom around her. She was 8 years old again, sitting on a worn wooden piano bench in her grandmother's small house outside Savannah, Georgia. The old upright piano had chipped ivory keys, a faded walnut finish, and pedals that squeaked whenever she practiced. It was far from perfect, but to Naomi it had always sounded beautiful. Every Saturday morning, her grandmother prepared sweet tea, opened the windows to let the summer breeze drift through the curtains, and reminded her of the same lesson before every practice session. "Do not play to impress people," she would say with a warm smile. "Play so someone who feels alone will remember they are not." Years later, Professor Whitmore heard Naomi perform during a community recital and immediately offered her a scholarship to a prestigious youth conservatory. For nearly a decade, Naomi's life revolved around rehearsals, competitions, master classes, and concert stages. Critics praised her remarkable sensitivity. Judges admired her discipline. More than once, respected musicians predicted she would become one of the brightest young concert pianists of her generation. But life rarely follows the same score that music does. When Naomi was 20, her grandmother became seriously ill. The woman who had sacrificed everything to raise her suddenly needed someone to return that same love. Naomi quietly declined international opportunities, withdrew from conservatory performances, and accepted several jobs to pay medical bills while caring for the person who had first placed her hands upon a piano. She never announced her decision publicly. She never complained. By the time her grandmother peacefully passed away, years had slipped by. Concert invitations faded. New talents emerged. The world simply moved on. Naomi never blamed anyone for forgetting her name, because she had never pursued music to become famous. She continued playing only when empty churches, community centers, or quiet hotel ballrooms offered a piano after hours. Music remained part of her life even when applause no longer was. The conductor listened without interrupting, his expression filled with quiet respect. "You gave up a remarkable career," he finally said. Naomi smiled gently. "No," she answered. "I chose the person who first taught me what success really meant." Those words reached Ethan Caldwell just as he stepped closer, intending to thank the guests for their patience before resuming the evening's program. Instead, he stopped without saying a word. For the first time since building his empire, he wondered whether achievement measured only by titles, headlines, and fortune had blinded him to another kind of greatness that could never be listed on a balance sheet. Before we continue, if you enjoy stories where the most overlooked people reveal the greatest strength, subscribe to Hidden Table. Here, every story reminds us that courage, integrity, and kindness can come from the most unexpected places. Now, let's see what happened next. The ballroom no longer buzzed with the effortless confidence that had filled it earlier that evening. Instead, conversations unfolded in quieter voices, shaped less by status and more by genuine curiosity. Investors who normally debated market forecasts were discussing music. Philanthropists who had spent years funding prestigious arts organizations quietly compared memories of performances they had witnessed around the world, and nearly every conversation returned to the same unexpected question. How had someone with Naomi Brooks's extraordinary gift remained hidden in plain sight? Naomi answered none of those questions. She simply picked up a fresh tray of sparkling water and resumed her shift exactly where she had left it. She greeted each guest with the same warm professionalism she had shown before anyone knew her story. She refilled glasses without seeking recognition. She thanked guests for moving their chairs so she could pass. Nothing about her demeanor suggested she believed the evening now belonged to her. That quiet humility somehow impressed people even more than the performance itself. Ethan Caldwell observed every movement from across the ballroom. For years, he had measured character through ambition, resilience through financial success, and intelligence through business results. Naomi challenged every one of those assumptions simply by returning to work without expecting applause to change her identity. She had just earned the admiration of an entire room, yet she behaved as though serving others remained every bit as honorable as standing beneath a concert spotlight. That realization unsettled him far more deeply than the music ever had. A distinguished gentleman with silver hair slowly approached Naomi as she stopped beside his table. "Miss Brooks," he said kindly, "my wife and I support young musicians throughout the country. We have attended performances in Boston, Philadelphia, and San Francisco. Tonight was among the most moving interpretations I have ever heard." Naomi smiled gratefully. "Thank you, sir. That means a great deal." The gentleman hesitated before asking, "Do you ever think about returning to the concert stage?" Naomi glanced briefly toward the grand piano before answering. "Music never left my life," she replied softly. "The stage simply became smaller. Sometimes it was an empty church, sometimes a neighborhood center, sometimes this ballroom after everyone had gone home. The audience changed, but the purpose never did." The gentleman nodded thoughtfully, realizing her answer carried more wisdom than explanation. Nearby, the elderly piano technician listened with quiet satisfaction. He understood exactly what she meant because he had often remained after midnight tuning instruments in silent halls, believing that beautiful music did not require a full audience to matter. Across the room, the hotel manager approached Ethan with a cautious expression. "Sir," he began respectfully, "there is something I probably should have told you months ago." Ethan looked at him with curiosity. The manager explained how he had occasionally heard extraordinary piano music drifting through the ballroom long after events had ended. Each time, he eventually discovered Naomi practicing alone before quietly locking the instrument and returning to finish her cleaning duties. She always stopped the moment anyone noticed her, the manager admitted. "I thought she simply enjoyed playing. I never imagined." His voice faded before finishing the sentence. Ethan slowly looked back toward Naomi, who was helping an elderly couple find their seats with the same calm kindness she had shown throughout the evening. Suddenly, the challenge he had issued no longer felt spontaneous. It felt careless, not because she had proven him wrong, but because he had never paused long enough to wonder who she really was before deciding who she could not possibly be. For the first time in many years, Ethan recognized a truth that no board meeting had ever taught him. The most valuable people in any room were not always the ones standing closest to power. Sometimes they were quietly serving everyone else while carrying gifts the world had never taken the time to see. As the evening slowly returned to its elegant rhythm, the atmosphere inside the ballroom had changed in ways no event planner could have designed. Earlier, people had gathered around Ethan Caldwell because influence naturally followed him. Now, small circles of guests quietly formed wherever Naomi happened to be serving. Nobody interrupted her work. They simply waited until she finished helping another table before offering a sincere compliment or asking a respectful question. She answered each person with the same gentle smile, never allowing admiration to distract her from the responsibilities she had arrived to perform. Watching from across the room, Ethan realized that respect earned freely carried a different weight than attention purchased through status. One was requested, the other was given. A member of the foundation's board approached him holding a program from the evening's gala. "Ethan," she said quietly, "I have attended your events for nearly 15 years. Tonight will be remembered for many reasons, but none of them will have anything to do with our fundraising numbers." Ethan accepted the remark with a thoughtful nod. He understood exactly what she meant. The ballroom had witnessed something that could not be measured by financial reports or press coverage. It had witnessed character revealed under pressure. Across the room, Naomi paused beside an elderly couple celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary. They thanked her warmly for the performance, explaining that the melody had reminded them of the song played during their first dance decades earlier. Naomi listened with genuine interest before quietly asking whether they had enjoyed their dinner. The couple laughed softly, surprised that after everything that had happened, she remained more concerned about their evening than about discussing herself. The elderly piano technician watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. He leaned toward the orchestra conductor and said, "Talent may open a door, but humility decides how long people remember your name." The conductor smiled. "And tonight she gave us both." Nearby, several young hotel employees whispered among themselves with unmistakable pride. They had always admired Naomi's patience during difficult shifts, her willingness to help coworkers stay late, and her habit of encouraging new employees who felt overwhelmed. Learning about her extraordinary musical background did not change who they believed she was. Instead, it explained why kindness had always seemed to come so naturally to her. Ethan slowly crossed the ballroom, stopping beside the grand piano that remained beneath the spotlight. He rested one hand gently on its polished surface, replaying the evening in his mind from the moment he had invited Naomi forward. What troubled him most was not that he had underestimated her musical ability. It was that he had never considered asking a simple question before making an assumption. "Who are you?" That question now echoed louder than the applause had. At that moment, a framed photograph displayed near the charity auction caught his attention. It featured Professor Eleanor Whitmore standing beside several of her most accomplished students from years earlier. Ethan stepped closer. There, in the front row, was a much younger Naomi, smiling beside the celebrated teacher while holding a national youth competition trophy. Beneath the photograph, a small plaque listed the names of every student. Naomi Brooks. First prize. National Young Artists Invitational. Ethan stared at the image for several long seconds, realizing the answer had been hiding in plain sight all along. She had never exaggerated her past. She had never corrected anyone's assumptions. She had simply continued living with quiet dignity while the world overlooked what was already there. Behind him, the foundation board chair approached with a surprised expression. "You knew she was one of Eleanor Whitmore's students?" he asked. Ethan slowly shook his head. "No," he answered honestly. "Tonight is the first time I realized how little I actually knew about the people standing right in front of me." As the city lights shimmered beyond the ballroom windows, Ethan understood that the evening's greatest revelation was not Naomi's remarkable gift. It was the uncomfortable truth that extraordinary people often remain invisible until someone gives them an opportunity, even for the wrong reasons, to let their true character speak for itself. The discovery spread through the ballroom with remarkable speed, not because anyone announced it from the stage, but because genuine admiration always traveled faster than rumor. Within minutes, guests who had been studying the photograph quietly began sharing what they knew about Professor Eleanor Whitmore and the remarkable students she had mentored throughout her distinguished career. Several recognized Naomi's name from old competition programs they had attended years before. Others remembered newspaper articles celebrating a gifted young pianist whose future had once seemed limitless before she quietly disappeared from the concert world. None of them had known where her journey had led. Now they did. Ethan Caldwell stood motionless before the display, reading Naomi's name again and again as though each glance revealed another lesson he had somehow overlooked. The foundation board chair gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "You are not the only one who missed it," he said quietly. "The difference is that tonight you have the opportunity to learn from it." Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes remaining fixed on the photograph. Across the ballroom, Naomi continued helping guests with the same calm professionalism she had shown from the beginning of the evening. She laughed softly with an elderly couple as she refreshed their coffee. She carried fresh dessert plates to another table. She thanked a young busser for assisting her with a heavy serving tray. There was no trace of disappointment about the career she had left behind. There was no bitterness hiding beneath her smile. The grace she offered everyone around her appeared effortless because it had been practiced for years, not for recognition, but because it reflected the person she had chosen to become. The orchestra conductor quietly approached Ethan with folded hands. "Do you know what impressed me most?" he asked. Ethan looked toward him with genuine curiosity. "It was not her technique," the conductor continued. "Many musicians can achieve extraordinary precision. What cannot be taught so easily is generosity." Every phrase she played was offered as a gift, not as a demonstration. That is why everyone in this room stopped breathing when she touched those keys. Ethan absorbed the words without interruption. Throughout his career, he had rewarded ambition, celebrated excellence, and respected discipline. Yet generosity had rarely appeared on the list of qualities he valued most. Tonight, that omission suddenly seemed impossible to ignore. Nearby, the distinguished arts patron who had first recognized Naomi's musical background spoke quietly with several guests before approaching the hotel manager. "Would you please ask Miss Brooks if she would accept a private invitation after her shift?" she asked. Several organizations would be honored simply to hear her story. The manager smiled warmly. "I will certainly ask, but I cannot promise she will accept. She has always been remarkably humble." The woman nodded with admiration. "Perhaps that is exactly why people hope she will." Ethan slowly walked toward the service station where Naomi was arranging fresh linens for the next course. For the first time that evening, he noticed details he had completely ignored before. The care she gave to every folded napkin. The patience with which she answered every request. The quiet encouragement she offered younger staff members whenever they seemed uncertain. None of those qualities had appeared suddenly after the performance. They had always been there. He simply had not taken the time to see them. As he stopped a respectful distance away, Naomi looked up and offered the same polite smile she had given every guest throughout the evening. There was no resentment in her expression, no desire to remind him of what had happened. Only calm professionalism and genuine kindness. That simple smile carried more weight than any criticism could have. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the gentle glow of chandeliers and the soft murmur of a transformed ballroom, Ethan realized that the greatest performance of the evening had not ended at the piano. It continued every time Naomi chose dignity over pride, humility over recognition, and compassion over the opportunity to make someone else feel small. For the remainder of the evening, no scheduled speech carried the same impact as the quiet conversation that had unfolded beside the service station. Guests continued discussing charitable initiatives and future partnerships, but every meaningful exchange seemed to circle back to the same lesson. Character had entered the ballroom wearing a simple black server's uniform, and nearly everyone had failed to recognize it at first. Ethan Caldwell stepped onto the stage for what had originally been planned as the foundation's closing remarks. The prepared speech waiting on the podium remained untouched. He looked across the ballroom, taking in the familiar faces of business leaders, educators, musicians, community advocates, and hotel employees who had all witnessed the remarkable transformation of the evening. After a long pause, he smiled gently and pushed the printed pages aside. "I spent weeks preparing a speech about leadership," he began. "Tonight, I realized I was not the person who should be giving it." The room grew completely quiet. Ethan continued with calm honesty. "Many of us have spent our lives learning how to identify opportunity. We study resumes, financial statements, market trends, and credentials. We become so confident in our ability to evaluate people that we sometimes forget to do the simplest thing of all. We forget to truly see them." His words carried none of the polished confidence usually associated with keynote addresses. They carried reflection instead. He turned slightly toward Naomi, who had quietly resumed assisting the staff near the back of the ballroom. "Earlier this evening, I looked at someone and saw only the role she happened to be performing. I failed to recognize the years of discipline, sacrifice, compassion, and quiet excellence standing right in front of me. That mistake belongs to me, but I hope the lesson belongs to all of us." No one applauded immediately. The silence itself felt more meaningful than interruption. Ethan looked toward the hotel staff gathered near the entrance. Every person who helps create evenings like this deserves to be treated with the same respect we offer our honored guests. Titles may describe what someone does. They never define who someone is. Several employees exchanged emotional smiles, surprised to hear their work acknowledged so publicly. The foundation board members nodded in quiet agreement. The distinguished arts patron wiped away a discreet tear before smiling toward Naomi with unmistakable admiration. When Ethan finished speaking, the applause rose naturally throughout the ballroom. It was steady, sincere, and remarkably different from the applause that usually followed successful fundraising announcements. It celebrated humility more than achievement. As the guests slowly prepared to leave, business cards and handwritten notes began appearing on the table beside Naomi. Invitations to perform at community concerts, requests for private meetings, scholarship contacts, offers from nonprofit organizations dedicated to expanding arts education. Naomi thanked each person with genuine warmth, but accepted nothing immediately. She carefully placed every card inside a simple envelope, explaining that thoughtful decisions deserved thoughtful time. The response only deepened the respect people already felt for her. Before departing, the elderly piano technician quietly approached Naomi one final time. He handed her a small brass piano key that had once belonged to an antique concert instrument beyond repair. "I have carried this for years," he said softly. "I always believed I would know the right person when the time came." Naomi accepted the keepsake with grateful eyes. "I will treasure it," she replied. The technician smiled. "Do not treasure it because it is rare. Treasure it because it reminds you that even one key can help create something beautiful when placed among others." As the final guests disappeared into the cool evening and the ballroom lights gradually dimmed, Naomi paused beside the grand piano once more. She gently rested her fingertips against its polished surface for only a moment before quietly returning to help fold linens alongside the rest of the staff, proving once again that genuine greatness never needed the spotlight to remain extraordinary. The ballroom stood almost empty now. The crystal chandeliers still glowed overhead, but their brilliance had softened into something quieter, warmer, as though the room itself had learned the difference between luxury and meaning. Hotel employees folded table linens, gathered polished silverware, and carefully carried floral arrangements toward the service hallway. Naomi Brooks worked beside them without hesitation, laughing softly with her co-workers as though the extraordinary events of the evening had belonged to someone else. The Grand Steinway remained beneath its solitary spotlight, silent once again, patiently waiting for another pair of hands someday. Ethan Caldwell lingered near the entrance long after most of the guests had departed. His driver had already informed him twice that the car was ready, yet he found himself unable to leave. Throughout his career, he had walked away from billion-dollar negotiations without looking back. Tonight felt different. Some moments deserved to remain with a person long after the lights dimmed. Before stepping outside, Ethan quietly crossed the ballroom one last time. Naomi was placing the final stack of neatly folded napkins onto a service card when she noticed him approaching. She smiled politely, exactly as she had at the beginning of the evening. Nothing about her expression suggested she expected another apology or another offer. She simply greeted another person with kindness. Ethan extended his hand. "Thank you," he said sincerely, "not only for the music, but for reminding me that leadership begins long before anyone enters a boardroom." Naomi accepted the handshake with quiet warmth. "And thank you," she replied, "for choosing to listen after the music stopped. That is where real change usually begins." Ethan nodded slowly. There was nothing left to add. Some lessons became smaller when too many words surrounded them. As he finally walked toward the doors, he glanced back once more. Naomi had already returned to helping a younger employee organize the remaining glassware, patiently showing her the safest way to carry an overflowing tray without spilling a single glass. She taught with the same grace she had played. She served with the same excellence she had performed. Nothing about her character depended upon who happened to be watching. Weeks later, the Caldwell Foundation quietly announced a new national scholarship supporting talented young musicians from overlooked communities, honoring mentors who believe that opportunity should never be limited by circumstance or first impressions. The program carried no reference to one unforgettable evening, yet everyone involved understood exactly where the inspiration had come from. Naomi accepted an invitation months later to perform at a community arts fundraiser benefiting music education for children. She requested no special introduction, no dramatic biography, and no mention of the gala. She simply asked that every child attending be allowed to sit close enough to see the pianist's hands, just as her grandmother had once encouraged her to do. The audience applauded the performance, but what they remembered most was the quiet conversation she shared afterward with young students who dreamed of playing their own first recital one day. Years passed, and people occasionally retold the story of the elegant gala where a waitress unexpectedly transformed an entire room. Some remembered the breathtaking performance. Others remembered the apology. Many remembered the standing ovation. But those who truly understood the story remembered something deeper. They remembered that greatness had never been hidden beneath a uniform. It had only been hidden beneath other people's assumptions. Naomi never needed wealth to prove her worth. Ethan never needed humiliation to discover humility. And everyone who walked through those ballroom doors that evening left carrying the same unforgettable lesson. The strongest people are rarely the loudest. The wisest hearts seldom announce themselves. Sometimes the greatest gift you can offer another human being is not applause after they reveal their brilliance. It is the respect to see their humanity before they ever have to prove it. Power may open doors. Talent may fill concert halls. But character is what echoes long after the final note fades away. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Hidden Table and join a community that believes true character is revealed not by power or status, but by courage, integrity, and kindness. Thank you for watching. And until next time, we'll save you a seat at the Hidden Table.